Considering the current makeup of the program, South Carolina could be the next great recruiting power in college football.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, your show for the latest headlines and potential storylines on South Carolina Gamecock athletics. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also a lead staff writer for Gamecocks Digest over on SI.com. Thank you for making Locked On Gamecocks your first listen or watch here today. We are free and available both on YouTube and also wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. When it comes to the sport of college football, recruiting is the lifeblood of each and every single program. And we've talked about this before on the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. And thankfully for South Carolina football fans, recruiting has been the least of Shane Beamer and this coaching staff's problems over the past couple of years. And while they've obviously been progressing in this facet, when it comes to some of these other top programs like Alabama and Georgia, for instance, in the SEC, there's still a lot of ground to be made up, at least in terms of the national perspective on South Carolina when it comes to recruiting. But I will say, because of the way South Carolina's coaching staff is currently constructed, what they have shown they can do under Shane Beamer, and what they have available in terms of resources, South Carolina can be the next great recruiting power in college football. Now, how do I define a great recruiting power? Well, I decided not to get too in-depth with this. I determined that a great recruiting power is a college football program that finishes in the top 15 every single year in the final recruiting rankings. And when looking back at the past 5 years, the following programs I'm about to list all finished in the top 15 every single year: Alabama, Georgia, Texas, Oklahoma, Ohio State, LSU, Oregon, Clemson, and Texas A&M. A pretty big list with a lot of heavy hitters. But I think that South Carolina can join this group in the very near future. And there's a couple things that I think the Gamecocks have going for them. The first factor is the fact that South Carolina has proven very quickly under Shane Beamer and this current staff that they can recruit the very best in the sport, that they can attract top-end talent for football. When looking at On3's industry rankings, which takes the average of all of the major recruiting service websites and their rankings and combines them into one, Shane Beamer and his coaching staff finished their first full season at South Carolina with the 28th overall recruiting class and the second worst class, admittedly, in the SEC. In his second season, however, Shane Beamer reeled in the 16th overall recruiting class, which ranked 7th in the SEC, so right in the middle of the pack. And right now, in the 2024 recruiting cycle, the Gamecocks have the 6th overall recruiting class in the entire country. So when I say you've got to attract talent before you can get more, and the main message that this is sending is that, first of all, players are resonating with Shane Beamer and this coaching staff and what all they've got going on both in the building and also on the football field. And the other thing is the Gamecocks are bringing in some of the best prospects in the entire country, irregardless of position. They, of course, brought in one of the best athletes to come out of the high school ranks in some time in Nicholas Harper in the 2023 recruiting cycle. They're now looking to do the same in the 2024 recruiting cycle with five-star edge rusher Dylan Stewart, who I'm going to talk about a little bit more later on today's show. But to put it bluntly, Shane Beamer and this staff, they are getting proven results. They are not relying on hope and a vision like they were at the beginning of their tenure. They now have proven results to back up what it is they're saying. And you cannot underestimate that enough when it comes to recruiting on the gridiron. The second reason why I think South Carolina can become a recruiting power in college football in the very near future is the coaches that they have on their roster. The first thing to really note with these coaches is the connections that they have when it comes to the national recruiting landscape. Shane Beamer has been all over the place throughout his college football career to this point, being in regions like the DMV, the state of Mississippi, highly underrated in terms of high school football talent. Of course, South Carolina, the state of Georgia, one of the deepest states in the country for high school football, and the state of Oklahoma. So he's got some Midwestern ties in there as well. Running back coach Mario Hardesty has connections to the Charlotte region. Wide receivers coach Justin Stepp has former connections to the state of Texas, probably the biggest state when it comes to high school football. Sterling Lucas has connections to the state of North Carolina, along with Travian Robertson and Clayton White and Pete Lembo. Going back to Travian Robertson, he's got connections to the Atlanta metro area, which is a big-time hub for football talent, and he developed connections there during his time at Georgia State. Torian Gray also has connections to the state of Virginia and the state of Florida, with Florida in particular being another really deep state when it comes to high school football talent. So you get the overall point here. South Carolina's overall connections when it comes to their assistant coaches are scattered all across the map, which is a good thing for the Gamecocks and will help them out in multiple different recruiting battles. The other thing is obviously the way that these assistant coaches recruit these players. These guys talk about how when they come to campus, all the coaches recognize them by name and they all say hello to them while they are on their visit. It's something that sticks out to these kids. It is something that they do not see at really any other place, and it is consistent. They don't do this for just the 5-star and 4-star kids. The coaching staff does this with every single kid that comes onto campus. It's just different down here when it comes to the family environment and the culture at South Carolina. Now, my final reason why I think South Carolina can become a great recruiting power in the sport of college football in the next couple of years is a pretty obvious one. The Gamecocks have SEC resources to work with. When you look back at the teams that I mentioned earlier that have had a top 15 class in each of the last 5 years, it's no coincidence that half of those teams were SEC programs. And Texas and Oklahoma, once they're added in 2024, would make 6 SEC programs in this group. The Gamecocks received upwards of $50 million in distributed revenue from the 2021 through 2022 fiscal year in the SEC when it comes to football. The Gamecocks have SEC-type facilities. They've got SEC-type fan support. They've got all the ingredients to impress prospects in a variety of different ways. Through their NIL game, through the facilities and the way that they can train these guys up, and the fan support that they're going to have throughout their collegiate career. So when you combine all of these different facets of South Carolina's football program and look at each one of these when it comes to recruiting, South Carolina unquestionably can be one of the top recruiting powers in the sport of college football in the very near future for several years to come. Now, obviously, South Carolina has gotten off to a fantastic start in the 2024 recruiting class. And while they have locked up certain positions like offensive line and quarterback, for example, the Gamecocks are still in need of a few more players at certain position groups. What are those position groups and which one is the biggest position of need for the rest of this cycle? We're going to dive into that question in more detail in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by Built Bar. Now, if you are somebody that is looking to incorporate some more protein in your daily diet, I know that one of the toughest things to figure out is, well, What kind of protein do I need to intake? Which kind of brands should I trust? Is what I'm going to get going to actually be good for me? Is it going to be low in sugar content? If you're somebody that is trying to find the answer to that kind of problem, then I've got just the solution for you in Built Bar. Built Bar is the best protein bar out there on the market right now. They got a variety of different flavors to choose from, like churro, cookies and cream, raspberry, cookie dough chunk puffs, coconut chunk puffs. They're covered in 100% real chocolate, only 130 calories, including a whopping 17 grams of protein and just 4 grams of sugar. Now, you can get these bars at Built.com right this second, or you can go to your local Walmart or Sam's Club to get Built Bars today. If you go to Walmart, you'll find Built Bar in the pharmacy section where you can grab yourself a 4-bar box of select flavors. The same goes for Sam's Club, where you can find a 13-bar box also of select flavors. I promise you, you're going to thank me later, because Built Bar is where tasty is the new healthy. Welcome back to this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And speaking of every single day, thank you so much to all of you everydayers for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch when it comes to South Carolina Gamecock sports. All right, now let's dive into the biggest positions of need for Shane Beamer and his coaching staff throughout the rest of the 2024 recruiting cycle. And when it comes to the biggest positions of need, I think that we all can agree that the 3 biggest positions of need for the rest of this cycle are running back, wide receiver, and edge rusher. The question is, how would you rank these 3 positions of need? Who would you put first? Who would you put last? Well, I'm going to go through my ranking real quick, and I want to see how our ranking matches up, so feel free to do this along with me. The biggest position of need right now for the Gamecocks throughout the rest of this current recruiting cycle, in my opinion, is the wide receiver position. Now, right now, the Gamecocks currently have the following players on the roster: Antoine Juice-Wells, Amarian Brown, Xavier Legette, Takarion Joyner, Eddie Lewis, Landon Sampson, and Omega Blake. Now, they've got other players on the roster as well, but those are sort of the 7 main contributors from this wide receiver room heading into this next season. Antoine Juice-Wells, Amarian Brown, Legette, Joyner, and Lewis are all expected to be players that are going to depart and leave the program after this season. So that is 5 players right there that you are losing from your wide receiver core. Now, the Gamecocks still have a few more players that are going to be joining the team in the very near future. Guys like Kelton Henderson, CJ Adams, Elijah Caldwell, and Tyshawn Russell from the 2023 recruiting class. And the Gamecocks have Mazeo Bennett currently committed for the 2024 recruiting cycle. In my opinion, thinking about all of those different things, I think that South Carolina needs to get 2 more receivers in this current recruiting cycle. And the Gamecocks have a couple really good targets currently on their board. They've got North Carolina native Jonathan Paylor, who probably is right there at the top of their list. They got Texas native Parker Livingston, who they're also very high on. And very recently, they now can put Keelan Adams on their target board for the wide receiver position. Now, the Gamecocks, of course, are in really good position with Jonathan Paylor. As of right now, he has stated multiple times in the past that the Gamecocks lead for him. NC State is the biggest competition there. When it comes to Parker Livingston, the South Carolina Gamecocks, while they are heavily in the game here, in my opinion, I still think that they are fighting a bit of an uphill battle here against the home state Texas Longhorns. So this one is going to come down to probably the official visit for the Gamecocks in the month of June. And depending on how well that visit goes, it could decide whether or not the Gamecocks can land Parker Livingston at the end of the day. Keelan Adams visited the Gamecocks for the first time ever in his recruitment this past weekend and enjoyed the visit so much to where he sort of released a revamped top 5 that included the South Carolina Gamecocks after releasing a top 4 back in the winter. that did not include South Carolina. So the Gamecocks, nonetheless, got 3 good targets here for the wide receiver position, and I think that they need to land 2 out of those 3 guys before the end of this cycle. Now, the second biggest position of need, in my opinion, is the running back position. And this one is not really based on the numbers like I argue for the wide receiver position, but more so the nature of the position itself. Running backs are going to get dinged up. Running backs are going to get injured. And so because of that, you've got to make sure that you've got bodies there at that position for when a guy does get nicked up and needs to come out of the game, maybe for a drive or misses multiple consecutive weeks. Right now, South Carolina is not in the best situation when it comes to depth at the running back spot. They got Juju McDowell, Mario Anderson Jr., and Dacaron Joyner as sort of the 3 main guys currently in that rotation. Dacaron Joyner is the one guy that we expect to obviously lead the program, as he's going to be playing his final year of eligibility here at South Carolina this upcoming fall. Now, South Carolina is going to add Dontavius Braswell from the 2023 class later on this summer, and he's expected to push for significant snaps here in this running back rotation once he gets on campus. So, in my opinion, with all that bearing in mind, the Gamecocks need to get one more guy, but it would be nice of them if they could get 2 or 3 guys in this class because of the heavy amount of experience that all these guys have at this position. The Gamecocks have some good targets here for this running back spot. Anthony Scooter Carey from the state of Florida, Daniel Hill from the state of Mississippi, and Peyton Lewis, I believe, from the state of Virginia. And he has got a top 6 currently of Georgia, Florida, Alabama, South Carolina, Tennessee, and I want to also say Virginia Tech in that mix. The Gamecocks are in a good spot with all 3 of these guys, but especially Daniel Hill and probably Anthony Scooter Carey right behind him, with Peyton Lewis probably being more of a question mark depending on how these other dominoes fall here at the running back spot. Now, this means that, in my opinion, the least important position of need out of these 3 specific positions is the defensive end or edge rusher spot. Now, obviously, while that is currently the case in my eyes, the biggest target arguably lies at this current position, as Dylan Stewart is currently South Carolina's most renowned target on their recruiting board. In my opinion, they need to get at least one guy in this class, and it seems like Dylan Stewart is basically the one and only guy that they have really got a good shot for and obviously are heavily pushing for at this current moment in time. The Gamecocks do have Jordan Stratton, Terrell Dawkins, Desmond Mayozulu, Tyreek Johnson, and Brian Thomas Jr. all currently on the roster. Jordan Stratton is the one player that is expected to depart the program after this season, as again, it's another case of he's going to run out of eligibility at some point, and it's going to likely happen this upcoming fall. Now, the Gamecocks did recently receive great news in the form of Syracuse transfer Jatius Gear, who is going to be joining the program this upcoming summer and will surely be a fixture in this defensive end rotation. But again, considering the fact that Jordan Stratton is going to be graduating soon and probably the lack of proven depth at this spot, the Gamecocks definitely need to add some more talent, some more firepower to this position group, and Dylan Stewart is very clearly their guy at this spot. All right, now for the final portion of today's show, I want to dive into a recent post-spring power ranking that was released for the entire SEC by On3 Sports, Jesse Simonton, who covers the Southeastern Conference very closely when it comes to football especially. So here is Jesse Simonton's SEC power rankings, and don't worry, for those of you listening to today's show on an audio podcast app, I'll read it out loud for you real quickly. Number 1 is the Georgia Bulldogs. Number 2 is LSU. Number 3 is Alabama. Number 4 is Tennessee. 5th is Ole Miss. 6th is Arkansas. 7th is Texas A&M. 8th is Kentucky. 9th is South Carolina. 10th is Mississippi State. 11th, Auburn. Florida, 12th. 13th is Missouri. And the last place team in this power ranking by Jesse Simonton is the Vanderbilt Commodores. Now, to get into this power ranking, I want to discuss a couple different things. I'll start off with South Carolina's standing overall in the SEC East by itself. So, based on Jesse Simonton's power ranking here, he's got South Carolina slotted fourth in the SEC East, behind Georgia, Tennessee, and Kentucky, and ahead of Florida, Missouri, and Vanderbilt. And I gotta say, I know that there's probably a lot of Gamecock fans out there that disagree with Jesse Simonton's power rankings, maybe from an overall standpoint or from an SEC East standpoint. When it comes to the SEC East, I don't have much of an issue with where Jesse Simonton slotted South Carolina. I think that the Gamecocks, again, still have a couple of question marks heading into this upcoming season. I think that South Carolina needs to find some answers at the offensive tackle position specifically, and obviously with the rest of the offensive line when it comes to run blocking. I think South Carolina needs to have a running back step up out of that room. I think the Gamecocks need to answer some questions at the edge rusher position. I think that South Carolina needs some more guys to step up at wide receiver. You get my overall point. I think that there's a lot of fair and valid questions right now to ask of South Carolina. When it comes to Kentucky, for example, the Kentucky Wildcats have one big question mark for their team next year, and that is the offensive line position. And while that's obviously a big question mark because of the importance of that position group, that's really the only question mark to speak of when it comes to Kentucky. You know that they're going to be fine on defense because defensive coordinator Brad White is an absolute mastermind in terms of utilizing his personnel. And the Wildcats, they got good skill position players, and they added Devin Leary from NC State this offseason. It's understandable to see why South Carolina is slotted behind them. Now, in terms of Missouri and Florida, they got massive questions at the quarterback position. And we've seen this time and time again in the sport of football. You can have a very good roster overall on defense and when it comes to most of the positions on offense. But if you do not have the right guy at quarterback to lead your team, then you're going to be handicapped in terms of what you can do this upcoming football season. So, in terms of the SEC East, I think it is fair for South Carolina to be slotted fourth behind Kentucky and ahead of Florida and Missouri in this case. Now, in regards to the overall discussion in the SEC, the only real issue that I have with Jesse Simonton's ranking is honestly the fact that he's got Ole Miss 5th and Arkansas 6th. While I do believe the SEC West is actually going to be a little bit better than the SEC East in 2023, I don't really think that Ole Miss and Arkansas should be that far ahead of, say, a South Carolina that's slotted 9th. I think that Ole Miss has got a lot of question marks in terms of their defense. Obviously, that was their weak spot this past year. It's been their weakness for the majority of the past several years. And while they added Alabama defensive coordinator Pete Golding this offseason, I just don't really know how good of a coach Golding actually is. I feel like that Pete Golding got less with more at Alabama, and he's not going to have anywhere near the same amount of talent with the Ole Miss Rebels. So I think that this might be a year where Lane Kiffin, that offense, is going to have to score a lot of points if Ole Miss is going to win a lot of games this next season. And then with Arkansas, the main question mark I have with them is, okay, you return quarterback KJ Jefferson and running back Raheem Rocket Sanders. That's a very good quarterback running back duo, potentially the best in the entire conference coming back this coming season. But outside of those two guys, who else does Arkansas have that really opposing teams have got to account for, that opposing teams have to fear going into 2023? I just cannot name one off the top of my head. And so, if that's going to be the case, and we're assuming that the SEC West is going to be a little bit better than the East this season, I don't see how you have Arkansas slotted as the fourth best team in that division and the sixth best team overall in that entire conference. I would probably have Arkansas honestly slated either 8th or 9th overall on this list. So I have an issue with those two, and if you want me to nitpick just a little bit more, I would probably slot Florida honestly 13th behind Missouri and ahead of Vanderbilt. I think that Florida's got a lot of question marks going into this next season. Obviously, I mentioned the quarterback position just a little bit ago. And with me, the main thing with Florida is the way that their entire schedule sets up, which I'll dive more into once we get closer to football season. But I think this could be a rough year for the Florida Gators. And with how bad the offense was overall in their spring game, I don't see how you put them ahead of two different teams from this spring. I know that Missouri did not host a spring game. Apparently, I think they had to move it to an indoor facility because of inclement weather and all the like. But I still feel like that with Missouri's defense and what they did last year and the guys that they've added in the transfer portal this offseason, Missouri right now is a better team than the Florida Gators and even a better program at this current moment in time. So those are my overall thoughts on where South Carolina stands in Jesse Simonton's power rankings leaving the spring for the SEC, and when I think about some of the rest of the teams and where they are slated. What are your thoughts on Jesse Simonton's SEC power rankings coming out of spring practice? What do you think about South Carolina's potential to be a future recruiting power in the sport of college football? Let me know your thoughts on all of these topics and what else you think about South Carolina's football program down below in the comments section. If you're watching today's show on YouTube, or if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app, you can shoot me a direct message on Twitter at @alion_SC, and I'll try to respond to your message as quickly as I see it. But once again, thank y'all so much for tuning in to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. Have a great rest of your Tuesday, and I will catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.